All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really provocative book from what's known as the manosphere. That's a whole collection of websites and forums that focus on masculinity and men's issues. The book is called Why Women Deserve Less. And our job here, as always, is just to break down its central arguments, presenting them clearly, using the book's own logic and its own evidence. So let's start with the problem it claims to be solving. So the book kicks things off with this quote from another author, Rush Filizada, to really frame the issue. It's basically setting the stage. The idea is that the modern dating world is just this chaotic, frustrating, and at the end of the day, unfulfilling mess for men. And why? Well, according to the author, it's all driven by this environment of nonstop attention. Okay, so to really hammer this point home, the author lays out 3 cautionary tales. Each one is supposed to represent a man at a different stage in his life. So you've got Tom, he's just a teenager, and he gets publicly shamed on social media for having the courage to ask a girl out. Then there's Dick, a young professional who gets all excited for a date, invests his time, and then gets stood up. And to top it off, he sees her on Instagram with another guy. And finally, you have Harry. He's 78, and his life story, according to the book, is one of financial and emotional ruin from multiple divorces. Now, the book's argument here is that this isn't just a string of bad luck. These are supposed to be symptoms of a much bigger problem, a fundamental breakdown in how men and women relate to each other. So you gotta ask, right? What supposedly caused this massive breakdown? Well, this is where the author brings in his core framework. He explains this whole shift as a move from what he calls the old contract to a new contract between men and women. And he really lays these two out as polar opposites. So, on one hand, you have the old contract. The book is pretty blunt about this. It calls it transactional, even compares it to prostitution, where men provided resources and protection, and in return, they got sex and children. Then you've got the new contract. This is the modern era, right? Enabled by new tech, female independence, and it was supposed to be this amazing utopian ideal where relationships are all about pure choice and genuine desire, not just need. This leads to the big question the book asks. Did this new utopian era, this better world for relationships, did it actually happen? And the author's answer is a resounding, definitive no. In fact, the book argues that instead of making things better, this new contract led to a total statistical collapse across the board. Okay, so for Exhibit A, the book points to marriage rates. They've apparently plummeted to the lowest point ever recorded. We're talking half of the long-term historical average since 1900. And what about the people who do get married? Well, the book highlights that it's overwhelmingly women who are the ones initiating divorce. And that number, it says, jumps to a staggering 70 to 80%, and as high as 90% if the woman is college educated. And it's not just about marriage. The author argues that courtship itself has collapsed. And the evidence for this? He points to data showing that the percentage of young men who are virgins has almost tripled compared to previous generations. All right, so if the new contract was such a spectacular failure, according to the author, what went wrong? What was the big missing piece of the puzzle? And this right here is the book's big, central, and most controversial claim. The author basically says the whole project was doomed from the get-go because it failed to account for what it calls a fundamental biological mismatch of interest between the sexes. So how does the book try to back up this ugly truth? Well, it pulls up data from dating apps. It brings up an OkCupid study, where women apparently rated 80% of guys as unattractive. And then more recent data that suggests women are only swiping right on something like 5% of men. From the author's perspective, this is a clear sign of a genuine lack of interest in the vast majority of men. And to drive that point home, the book does this kind of calculation. It takes a bunch of different things it calls proxies for libido, stuff like porn consumption, testosterone levels, and averages them out. And the number it comes up with is that female sex drive is just 7.6% of male sex drive. The book then uses this to argue there's a huge fundamental gap in interest. Okay, so the argument takes a turn here. The book isn't just saying women lack interest. It's also claiming they failed to hold up their end of the bargain on that new contract we talked about. specifically the part about achieving true economic independence. To make this case, the book shows us some Department of Labor data on the most common jobs for men and women. And the argument it makes from this is that men dominate the fields it sees as critical for society to even function, the plumbers, electricians, mechanics. Meanwhile, it claims women tend to cluster in jobs it considers, more frivolous or less essential, like hairdressers or secretaries. Then it brings in a study from New Zealand, and based on this study, the book makes a pretty shocking claim that if you calculate all the taxes an average woman pays versus all the government benefits she receives over a lifetime, she ends up being a net economic liability to the tune of $140,000. And according to the author, this is a direct violation of the new contract's promise of independence.
Okay, so that's the diagnosis according to the book, a broken system where one side isn't interested and the other isn't holding up their end of the deal. So, what's a guy supposed to do? What's the book's proposed red pill solution?
The advice here is pretty direct. Stop what it calls the unreciprocated romantic pursuit of women. And instead, before you invest any of your precious resources, your time, your money, your energy, you're supposed to run it through this strict 5-step cost-benefit analysis. Ask yourself, who's actually benefiting from my investment? What are my total costs here? What am I giving up to do this? What are the opportunity costs? And let's be real, what's the actual chance I'll see a return? And when you add all that up, is it really worth it? And all of that really boils down to this, the book's core piece of advice for men. Stop pouring your time, money, and energy into women. Instead, you need to start investing all those resources back into yourself, your finances, your fitness, your own life. So in this last section, we're going to see how all this advice builds up into what the book basically frames as a whole new philosophy, a new reality for men.
And to illustrate this new reality, the book uses a really famous example, Tom Brady's divorce. It calls this the Tom Brady gamble. And the logic goes something like this. If a guy who is arguably one of the most successful men on the entire planet can't even guarantee a woman's happiness or her loyalty, then what chance does the average guy have? The argument is that for most men, the pursuit of a long-term relationship is just a massive, high-risk gamble.
So that's a tough spot, right? How are you supposed to navigate a world where, according to the book, even winning the game doesn't mean you win the prize? Well, the final strategy it offers isn't really a set of rules. It's more of a fundamental shift in your entire mindset. So here's the final directive from the book. It says men need to align their expectations with the reality that it's just laid out. It says a man's job, his only job really, is to become the absolute best version of himself that he can possibly be. And once he's done that, he should just let go. He should release himself from all responsibility for how a relationship turns out. That burden, the book argues, should be placed entirely on women. And this all leads to the book's final worldview, the takeaway philosophy for men. And it's all summed up in this one little phrase. The idea is that a man's focus should be 100% on achieving his own personal excellence. And female companionship, well, that's not a goal to be chased. It's just a possible side effect, a potential bonus for a life well lived.